Last week we sort of began a new preaching series, which I'm calling, Are We There Yet? All right. Anyone ever heard those words? They imply movement. You're on your way somewhere. And as a kid, they put you in the car, and you don't really have a sense of distance or how things are going to work, so you keep asking, are we there yet? Right. So now early on, I was not satisfied with that, being put in the car, not knowing where I was going. And so early on, I became obsessed with maps. In those days, you could get free maps at gas stations. Remember those days? You could walk in there. I would go in there and take one out of every map out of the rack, and I literally had hundreds of maps just because I loved maps and looking at them and knowing where we were going and looking for landmarks along the way and trying to figure out how far it was going to be. I like to mark progress. Now, as a church, and when I mean church today, I'm talking about not just this congregation, as a whole a church. We are in motion. The landscape is changing around us. We are going somewhere, and many of us want to know where we're headed and how long until we get there, which are great questions, and we're going to wrestle with those in the coming weeks as we move into the future. Obviously, the church is going to go through some changes. Our world is changing, and we need to talk about what do those look like? The one thing I know for sure is that we're not going back. Some people long for how life was 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. But culture has shifted, and it doesn't matter what kind of tweaks we do to worship, whether it's a style of worship or Sunday school curriculum or what flashy new technology we can use. We're not going to go back to what it was 40 years ago. Our journey is taking us into some new territory. So I've got good news and bad news about that. The bad news is that the model of church that many of us grew up with is not going to survive. And it's okay to grieve that because many of us love the way we grew up and how life was, but realize that is past and something new is happening. The good news is that God is in the resurrection business, right? And again has found new way, bringing new life, new expressions for the church. It has for thousands of years, and God has no intention of stopping doing that. So we have a choice. We can try to hang on to the past in spite of changes and just try harder, right? It's sort of like the horse-drawn carriage makers in face of the automobile. We can just make a better carriage, and people won't use automobiles. Or like Kodak when the digital cameras were developed. Actually, Kodak invented the first digital camera, but they didn't think it was going to catch on, so they sold it to Apple. All right, and so some of those kind of insights. It's hard to think about life being different than it is today. What was important was to try to identify what is the need going on. If you're a carriage maker, you said the need is not for carriages, the need is for transportation, and then you tool up as changes come. Well, in some ways, the church needs to look at some of this as well. But there's some obstacles to doing that. And one of the big obstacles in getting in the way of that is their idea that faith is primarily a system of beliefs that you adhere to, all right? And if that's your definition, if that's your only definition of faith, as a bunch of beliefs that you adhere to, instead of a way of living, then it's easy to get stuck. All right? Certainly they're related. The beliefs we have and how it gets lived out need to be integrated in some way. But when there's a disconnect, that's where the trouble comes. When we read in the Gospels, we heard Diane just read this just a second ago, where Jesus is in conflict with the religious leaders. He said, there's rules you have to follow. I don't know why or whatever we've been doing for thousands of years, you just got to do it. And Jesus says, if there's a need, if you're hungry, and there's food available, you share it, right? And was in conflict all the time with these religious leaders, not because religious leaders were bad people. They were very good people. They were trying extremely hard to be good people. But they were people who prized having the correct beliefs. And that was the most important thing for them. Their salvation, whatever that meant for them, was tied into following the rules, regardless of how it played out in the rest of life. So like in the lesson we heard earlier about keeping Sabbath laws, Jesus, again, found himself again and again and saying, the laws were not made so we could serve them. The laws were intended to serve us, to help us in this journey of growing in our relationship with God and with one another. We're going to see it again and again. When Jesus, Matthew has these 3 chapters, Matthew 5, 6, and 7 of Matthew, is what we call the Sermon on the Mount, the core teachings of Jesus, where he lays out the guiding principles. What does it mean to be a follower of Jesus? And one of the things he says is this. He says, you'll know, we're talking about who do you know how to follow, who to trust. He says, you'll know them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorns? Are figs gathered from thistles? In the same way, good trees bear good fruit. Bad trees bear bad fruit. So you have to see what this belief produces. He says, not everyone says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but those that do the will of my Father in heaven. A little later he says, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who builds his house on a rock. Rains fall, floods come, the winds blow and beat on the house, but it will not fall because it was founded on the rock. And Jesus is clear. He goes on, he talks about how the law is summed up in this. He says, you love the Lord your God, heart, soul, mind, strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's all you really need to know. Yet the lives of so many religious people then, even now, don't look like that. They don't look like love. From the very early years of the church, there were controversies over having the correct beliefs. They would fight wars over having the correct beliefs. And part of this controversy, about 300 years after the time of Jesus, we started establishing the creeds. They say, well, we need to know what is the line? How do we think about this deep mystery of God, the Trinity or the Incarnation? And so we developed some of these creeds. But through the centuries, churches have split over having the correct theological beliefs of who and when you baptize someone, or how does Holy Communion really work, or should we support or oppose slavery, or what do you think about predestination, or how do we interpret Scripture, or whether you speak in tongues or not, or whether women can have full participation in leadership of the congregation, or the inclusion of LGBT people. There's any number of issues that have caused splits in congregations because the idea was we have to have the correct set of beliefs. Result is we've got hundreds of denominations or non-denominational groups. Each of them, sure, they've got the correct version of that, correct beliefs. And if you have the correct beliefs, then you are saved. But Jesus says this. It's this powerful parable, he says, again in Matthew. He says, when the Son of Man comes in glory, he'll separate people just the way a shepherd separates sheep from the goats. And he'll say to those on his right, he says, come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. I was a stranger, you welcomed me. I was naked, you gave me clothing. I was sick, you took care of me. I was in prison, you visited me. And the people respond, they say, well, Lord, we never saw you hungry or thirsty or all those things. And he says, no, it's when you did it to someone else, you were doing it to me. I find this fascinating. When he's separating out the sheep and goats, he doesn't say, come enter the kingdom, you who have the correct system of beliefs. Or it doesn't even say you who are baptized, or you who said the right prayer, or you who have the right stance on whatever social issue is going on. He says, you who showed love and compassion belong with me. Come. Could it actually be that simple? When Apostle Paul set out to share the gospel, one of the first places he went was a place. Today we call it Turkey. Back then, a region of it was called Galatia. And Paul went to Galatia proclaiming good news. He says, we're not saved by following the rules, by doing certain stuff. We are saved by grace, undeserved love of God poured out upon us. Trouble was there were people who came after Paul to Galatia, and they were giving a different message. They were saying, no, you got to keep all the rules. There's certain rituals you have to do. You have to eat kosher foods. You have to follow all these rules if you want to be able to be part of this Christian thing, which necessitated Paul to write a letter. So we have this letter, the letter of Galatians, that Paul writes to them because they were getting confused. All right, what is it? Do we have freedom in the gospel because we're saved by grace, or do we have to do all the certain stuff in order to be saved? And Paul's clear. He says this. He says the only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. Right? He boils it down to them. He says, if it doesn't look like love, this isn't God working here. The only thing that counts, faith expressing itself through love. So when Paul talks about faith, he's not talking about cognitive assent to certain principles or facts. His definition of faith is a relationship, right? A way of living that focuses on loving God, loving our neighbor as ourselves. He goes on in the letter, he writes to them about this freedom we have. He says, you are called to freedom, brothers and sisters. But do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love, serve one another. The whole law is summed up in a single commandment: love your neighbor as yourself. When I was in confirmation class, most of our energy went into learning information. Had to memorize this catechism book, right? So I would have the right beliefs. There wasn't a whole lot of attention paid to how I would actually live that out. I think the assumption was if you had the right beliefs, the actions would come automatically. I don't think we can make that assumption. How do we translate what we believe or say we believe to how we live that out? I think we need to have guides and mentors to encourage us, to help us to find ways in which we take what we believe and make it a reality in the world around us. Because we live in a world that's not very loving. We need sometimes guidance, or those who've gone and have done this before, to say, how do we be authentic? How do we be consistent with the theology of grace? How do we translate this faith into action? Book of James, we find this. He says, what good is it, brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith, but don't have works? Can faith save you? I mean, if a brother and sister is naked, lacking in daily food, and one of you says, go in peace, be warm, eat your fill, but don't supply their bodily needs, what good is that? So faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. Someone will say, well, you have faith, and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works. I, by my works, will show you my faith. Beliefs become important because they shape our actions. If you believe that someone's skin color or gender or religion or political views makes them inferior to you, you might shout, send her back, right? If you believe you're going to be raptured out of here any minute now, there's no reason for you to care for the environment. What we believe makes a big difference. So paying attention to what we believe is important. Take some examination, because sometimes beliefs undergo changes. We go back and look at 500-600 years ago, right? The church believed, the official policy of the church is that the earth rotated around the sun, right? And people like Galileo and others, people were excommunicated, kicked out of the church because they dared to think that maybe the earth was not the center of the universe and everything revolved around it. We had to adjust what we believed, what we thought we knew for sure. And through the years, beliefs about gender or race or sexual orientation have challenged, have changed us as we try to figure out what is it about faith that is essential and unchangeable, and what is it that is part of our cultural norms, or as we discover and learn more, that these are things that need to be modified. Now that's the real rub. You try to figure out which one is which is essential, which is something that is cultural for us. I've done a lot of remodeling in my days. Our first home was built 100 years ago. The first home that we bought was a 100-year home. It was built to address needs for shelter, providing power and water and heat. And it was state-of-the-art at the time. Used the best technology available for them. We had knob and tube wiring. And we even had a 30-amp fuse box in the house, all right? There were lead pipes to bring fresh water into our house. There was asbestos-wrapped furnace ducts to prevent fire for us. The walls were made of the finest horsehair plaster and lath, insulated with newspaper, all right? Now, it was a great home. At its day, it provided all the needs they needed for power and water and heating quite nicely. But there came a time where it no longer safely met the needs of the people living there, not the way it was intended to be. And so remodeling became necessary. So over the years, rooms would be stripped down to the studs. That would try to figure out what is essential. Is this a load-bearing wall, or can this come out? And we had to figure that out. What is essential that without it, the house would fall. We would leave that, but then we changed everything else, updated the wiring, the plumbing, the insulation. All that looked quite different than what was there before, but it met the needs that were there at the very beginning. Now, if you wait 100 years before you make any changes, it is an awful lot of work to do all that. It's better to keep up with changes as they come. But as we know, remodeling is messy, it's disruptive, it's expensive, but necessary if it's going to move into the future. Well, I think it's an interesting model for us to think about as the church as well. In many ways, our church was built for a different time, and the world has changed. And so we need to figure out, what is it that are the load-bearing walls, the studs that cannot be removed, reinforce those, but then also be open to say, but what is the need if we're wanting to providing heat and water and power? What are the ways that we do that in a way that meets the needs of our world today? The question of what is essential, what can we let go of? That's the sort of the really bottom line question, and that's what we're going to be looking at in this series. And so come back next week if you want to hear what those are. No, it takes a while to discover that, and together we're going to talk about what are those kinds of things. But let's get the band wandering back up here. I think too often, I think our focus is on what I want right now, or what feels good, or what we feel we need, or to focus on the future. And I get that. But sometimes it's an important part of the process is looking back for what those have come before us have done with great appreciation, and to give thanks for those who have been faithful. We've been watching this TV show, Marie, what's her name? Marie Kondo. She talks about decluttering, and the stuff in her life. I talked about that before, and it says that there's something, if you want to go through all the stuff in your house, eventually you have to let go of something. And it says, and you can look at it and you can lift it up and she say, thank you. And then you can take it to the landfill and do that. But to recognize that this was something in its day, in its time, was something that was important. And moving on or remodeling doesn't mean it wasn't important at the time. And so we have a song simply called Thank You, a way of us remembering, giving thanks for all the ways that God has blessed us in the past, and maybe giving us courage to move into new futures as well. It's called Thank You, Lord.